Thank you very much for your warm reception. I was told that the dress code would be smart casual or rodeo. So clearly being London-based, I had no idea what rodeo meant. So this is my interpretation of smart casual. I hope I haven't offended anybody. I think what I wanted to talk about, I think if you're going to engage with this question of the Fed and the rest of the world, and I know we're talking a lot about the Fed, I think we've got to get back to what the principle of central banking is. Now, you can agree or disagree with the notion of central banking, but you have to accept that there is a theory and a practice which was established in London, funnily enough, a very long time ago. And I want to talk a little bit about that to see how far removed we are now. Now, A.J.P. Taylor, a great British historian, wrote a controversial book about the origins of the Second World War. And in it, I mean, he was a historian of left-wing persuasion. He refers to the 19th century, where he says men, and this is in pre-politically correct days, I'm afraid he doesn't say anything about women, but we know what he means. Men reared in the stable economic world of the later 19th century assumed that a country would not flourish without a balanced budget and a gold currency. And he says that very explicitly, in a slightly mocking tone, I would add, but we have to understand this dual element. And I'm going to talk a bit more about fiscal policy than perhaps my other companions and colleagues on this podium have done so far. And the beginning of all of this, I say, in terms of the theory of central banking, the best exposition of this is in a House of Commons debate in 1844, where the then Prime Minister, Robert Peel, introduced a bank charter bill. And if you read that speech, everything that we should know about central banking is in that speech, which he delivered in the second reading of the bill in 1844. And he put it very simply, and I'll quote extensively from it, not too much, but so that you get a flavor of the thinking behind this principle of central banking, and then we can see how far removed we are from it. My first question, this is Robert Peel speaking in 1844 on the floor of the House of Commons. My first question, therefore, is what constitutes this measure of value? What is the signification of that word, a pound, with which we are so familiar? And he simply defines the pound as a certain definite quantity of gold with a mark upon it to determine its weight and fineness. And he goes on to say that to pay a pound means nothing else and can mean nothing else than the promise to pay to the holder when he demands it that definite quantity of gold. And that's very, very simple. And very interestingly, in the House of Commons debate, only 30 MPs out of about 600 voted against the second reading of the Bank Charter Bill, which was to establish the Bank of England as a central bank. Now, the Bank of England had existed for 150 years before that, but the Bank Charter Act really, and I know this is more controversial, but the Bank Charter Act gave an exclusive provision to the bank to issue notes. And this was Peel's thinking behind this. He says, gold coin is now the principal measure of property. And that was a very explicit statement. And he said immediate convertibility into coin, this is of paper money, is all that would be needed to prevent the excessive issue of paper. And according to him, and Peel knew the country well, Britain did not want an abundant supply of cheap promissory paper. And I'm afraid he has some harsh words about the United States in this regard. He says the principle of free competition in note issue, which was left unchecked, had been a disaster. That was his word. I know it's Donald Trump's favorite word, but this is a much more sober politician, I would add. He said that was it, so that means very strongly that it was a disaster. And he said if other banks, free banking essentially, would create immoderate issues of paper, extravagant speculation, and would be followed by complete insolvency. And these are the words written, or rather said, in 1844. So very clearly, there's a gold-based currency and a central bank whose job it is to issue notes backed by the gold currency. And that is, in a nutshell, the theory of central banking. Very, very clear and very simple. And Walter Bagehot, wrote very famously in 1873 a book called Lombard Street, which would have huge implications and huge ramifications for the development of central banking, particularly in America. And Walter Bagehot was a classical liberal. He said the best thing a government can do with the money market is to let it take care of itself. But of course he said that on the basis of a strong central bank with what A.J.P. Taylor referred to as the gold currency. He wasn't saying there should just be wild speculation and a market should be underwritten by the central bank. He said that once you had a gold currency and once you had balanced budgets, then the market could be allowed to take care of itself. So there were strong underpinnings to this market. And the bit that we haven't really spoken about in terms of the maintenance of the gold standard and the maintenance of sound monetary regime is sound fiscal policy. Because what A.J.P. Taylor said, it was absolutely right. The second element was not only a gold currency, but a balanced budget. And those of you who know about British public finance will know that, and Neil Ferguson makes this point, that for 85 years, between 1815 and 1899, the budget was balanced every single year apart from 4 years, and which is an extraordinary record of fiscal discipline. But it's something that's often overlooked when people talk about the management of the gold standard. The whole point about having a strong gold currency was that you had very reliable and dependable fiscal policy as well. And once these two elements were combined, you had the long success, I would say, of British finance and geopolitical power, economic growth. These were the stable foundations which essentially underpinned the British Empire and British global power. Now, by 1913, this was under considerable pressure. And one civil servant said that the biggest problem, actually, this is before the First World War, was the continuous decline that this government had seen, the British government had seen over the last 25 years, in his words, a decline in the power to control expenditure. And there were lots of reasons for this. I mean, the civil servant talked about the pressures of democratic governments, and it's not the people's fault, but it's the politicians trying to pander to people, meant that there was an additional pressure on expenditure. And this, in a sense, was what put pressure on the gold standard. Now, we know that after 1913, 1914, there was the First World War. And essentially, Britain's ability to manage the gold standard was blown apart. And in my book, I suggest it wasn't blown apart because of gold reserves or anything like that. The Bank of England had always had very, very few gold reserves. I mean, that was one thing that observers noticed at the time, that the control of the gold standard, if you like, which was informally based in London, was almost a sort of sign of trust in the British government to manage its affairs and manage its fiscal affairs properly. The actual amount of gold in the Bank of England that it held was always actually a very small amount. And actually, the one figure that you should know in the First World War was that the balanced budget was thrown completely out of the window. So, these are rough amounts. The government expenditure in 1913 in sterling was about 800 million pounds. This is in 1913. By 1919, this had gone up to 11 billion sterling. So that's more than 14 times the expenditure. And Keynes himself said that, you know, before the war, we'd spent millions, but after the war, we spent hundreds of millions, and we didn't notice the difference. We thought we were much richer. And this was in his pre-general theory days, where he was much more focused on balanced budgets. And I've actually got a book of his in my pocket, it's such a slim book, called A Tract on Monetary Reform, which he published in 1923. And it was Milton Friedman's favorite book of Keynes. He said in this book, this was before he went all Keynesian, as it were, he was a very sound money man. And actually, when you have to understand about the gold standard, about Britain's role in it, and about John Maynard Keynes, I think you've got to appreciate the world in which he was living in. He grew up in a Victorian world. He was 31 when the First World War broke out. So all his formative experiences had been in this gold standard era of solid gold currency underpinned by balanced budgets. And this was something to which actually he was committed for a lot longer than people think. And in a way, I've tried to rescue Keynes in many ways from the Keynesians, because, I mean, for John Maynard Keynes, borrowing, having a 3% deficit of GDP when the economy was growing at 3%, and this is something that we experienced in Britain in 2005, the economy was growing at 3%, yet we were borrowing 3% of GDP. That would have been madness as far as John Maynard Keynes was concerned. He never advocated deficit financing in an expanding economy. The whole point about the theory was that it was a counter-cyclical one. Even as late as the 60s, people talked about compensatory finance. And compensatory finance means you're compensating. So as the economy contracts, that's when you borrow money. Now, you can argue about the pros and cons of that, but to suggest borrowing money when the economy was growing is a complete fallacy and is a negation of what he actually said. Lastly, I just want to say about, so these are very firm principles and where we are with regard to the Fed today. Now, it doesn't take an Einstein to work out that the conditions of the Fed, under which the Fed operates, could not be more different than the 19th century Bank of England. As an earlier speaker observed, America is in the position of Britain in the 1940s. It's bust, essentially. There were these huge twin deficits, a massive fiscal deficit, which is adding to the stock of debt, and a trade deficit. Now, people who understand about the old gold standard will know that the reason why Britain was the guardian of it was because it not only was the leading export power of the world for most of the 19th century. In fact, 1913 was the best trade year pretty much ever for Britain in terms of its current account surplus. It had not only the current account surpluses, it also had this incredibly disciplined fiscal management of balanced budgets. And this essentially was what underpinned the gold standard. Now, if you were trying to look at a country or a regime to underpin the gold standard today on an analogous basis, you would want a country that had large export surpluses and could manage balanced budgets. And there are two countries that spring to mind in this. One is China, but that's going through its own difficulties. The other is actually Germany. And Germany, if you look at the euro, is very much in the analogous position to what Britain was in the 19th century with respect to the global monetary system. I mean, obviously the pound sterling was what underwrote sort of world trade before 1900. And of course, Germany's role in the euro is analogous to that. Germany has export surpluses. Germany balances its budget, more or less. In fact, I think in 2016 it has a constitutional amendment, if you like, committing it to a balanced budget. And this is following from what the Swiss did 15 years ago, where the federal government in Switzerland was essentially not allowed to run a deficit of more than 1% of GDP in any year. And I think, you know, what I'm trying to say is that in order to manage a gold standard, and in order to show the real leadership that the global economic system requires, there needs to be a much healthier, much stronger approach to economic management in the United States. And now, from my point of view, I don't see this coming anytime soon, and unfortunately. And I think if America was to be serious, and this is something we should ponder in this room, if we are serious about having a gold standard, we need it to be underpinned by a much more, dare I say it, conservative, much more responsible approach, not only to monetary policy, which I know is the focus of this conference, but also to fiscal policy. Because if you want to understand what the gold standard was historically, you've got to understand, as A.J.P. Taylor said, the gold currency, and of course the balanced budget. And that's the element which, in a way, I think democratic governments are much more unsure about and have more difficulty to restrain the expenditure side. Now, let's look at the last few years in which the Fed have tried to sort of manage the global, well, the American economy. I mean, it's interesting that the Federal Reserve has a number of mandates. One of them is full employment, which has absolutely nothing to do with central banking. I mean, if you said to Robert Peel that the job of the Bank of England was to promote full employment, he simply wouldn't have understood what you were talking about. This is at such a variance from the principles of central banking that were established. And the sadness I have with regard to some of the Fed's later development is that the men who instituted the Federal Reserve in 1913 were very much under the influence of 19th century British practice. In fact, I think it was Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, who referred to Bagehot as a great teacher of economics. You can rely on the fact that Woodrow Wilson and a number of the people who were formulating policy with respect to monetary affairs would have read Lombard Street, which was published in 1873. And we know that. They talk about Lombard Street. Lombard Street was their sort of official Bible. They understood the principles of 19th century central banking. They turned their backs on the free banking that Robert Peel had denigrated in the House of Commons in 1844. And the Federal Reserve was very much, in its way, trying to mimic some of the aspects of the Bank of England. Now, subsequent history has completely unmoored the Federal Reserve from its original intention. The federal budget was balanced in 1913. In fact, American fiscal policy was, despite the effects of the Civil War, was very conservative. America, for most of the 20th century, ran considerable current account surpluses. It was only really in 1970-71 that the country became more indebted, or rather in deficit in the current account. And so the conditions of the gold standard for America was particularly unrealistic. And I agree with all those commentators, and I think a lot more work needs to be done on this from academics, relating the growth of inequality to fiat money and paper money. I mean, naturally, people who can game the system, a system which relies on printing huge amounts of paper currency, people who can game that system are going to be in a much more advantageous position than the average person. And I think that it's no accident that this last 45 years of fiat money has seen a much wider discrepancy in terms of people's incomes and wealth. Now, I know that's controversial, but I think I intuitively feel that there is a relationship between paper money, which can be gamed by all sorts of people with powerful interests, and a proper gold currency. I think it's for others. I'm not a lawmaker in your country, thankfully, probably for you. But I do feel that this is something which the Congress and the US people generally need to have answers about in terms of what kind of leadership the Fed can provide, given how poorly the economic, the fiscal, and the monetary policies have been managed in the last 40 years. Thank you very much.